Last week, we looked at several reasons why I believe Paul wrote the Pastoral Epistles, that is, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, in the New Testament. But as I shared, the majority of scholars, not the vast majority, but over 50%, believe these letters were not written by Paul, but are instead written by somebody impersonating someone else, in this case, Paul. So why do the majority of scholars believe that the pastoral letters are not actually written by Paul? Well, let's look at 4 of the big reasons. First, some have argued that when reading the pastoral letters, Paul presents himself as this idealized Christian hero, the model of faith who carries a church on his shoulders and all that. They say that this writing sounds like someone who admires Paul, rather than something that Paul would actually say of himself. But keep in mind that Paul is writing near the end of his life. He's probably going to be more reflective on his legacy as a pioneer for Christianity. He's also speaking to Timothy and Titus here, training them in how to lead a church. So you would expect that he would look back on his own leadership. And the idea of imitating Paul, following after his example, is an idea that we see Paul repeat in other letters which scholars unanimously agree came from him. So I find no reason to suggest a different author here. D.A. Carson and Douglas Moo take the response even farther. They say, this argument can be stood on its head. For some of what is said in the pastorals seems unlikely from the pen of a later admirer of Paul. Would such a person refer to Paul as the chief of sinners? Would he dredge up many years after Paul's death the fact that he had been a persecutor and violent man? And we may wonder whether such a person would remind people that at a critical hour there was nobody who stood by the great apostle. Second, many scholars don't think Paul wrote the pastoral letters because, they argue, these letters show 2nd century church life, but Paul lived in the 1st century. We see the author talking about elders, deacons, and overseers in a church. This implies that the Christian church has matured some. It's become organized with different roles of leadership. Paul lived in an earlier time when the church was first developing. Well, this argument struggles in that it doesn't seem to recognize that the church was maturing even in Paul's time. You have roles being defined and appointed in Acts 6. Overseers and deacons are mentioned in Philippians. Even in Paul's first missionary journey trip, he appointed elders for newly founded churches. Third, it is argued that the author of the pastoral letters describes himself in situations that don't match up with our understanding of Paul's life. For example, Titus 1:5 says, "This is why I left you in Crete." When were Paul and Titus hanging out in Crete? We don't know. But the reality is, there's a whole lot we don't know about Paul. I mean, the book of Acts tells us Paul's life, but it's not everything. It doesn't give us a year-by-year playbook. It also ends abruptly in Acts 28 when Paul is imprisoned in Rome. We know Paul died in Rome, but that doesn't mean Acts is the end of Paul's life. Many believe, as it says in 1 Clement, that Paul left Rome, traveled west, and was eventually imprisoned and killed at a later time in Rome. So there's all these chunks of Paul's life we don't have in the book of Acts, and a possible massive chunk after Acts, which we don't have. We shouldn't expect that all of the situations in the pastoral letters are going to line up with something we already know to be true of Paul's adventuring. We just don't know enough about his life. Fourth, and probably the biggest argument that Paul never wrote the pastoral epistles is this: they just don't sound like Paul. The letters have 306 words that don't appear in other writings of Paul. You find these things like, this statement is trustworthy, when Paul isn't known for talking that way. There are differences in grammar, style, theological concepts being brought together. Even if the other arguments for pseudepigraphy don't work, this one seems very convincing to the majority of scholars out there. They know what Paul sounds like, and it's not this. To drive the point home, it's argued that the pastoral letters use a vocabulary and writing style that sounds more like 2nd century writers than it does Paul. So once again, they argue that a later admirer of Paul must have been the real author. Here we find ourselves in the same situations as the book of Ephesians. I did a video on the author of Ephesians a while back trying to show that differences in style and vocabulary and all that are not as big of a deal as many make it out to be. Human beings are not so predictable. People are spontaneous. We act differently according to different moods we are feeling, different people we are around, different seasons of life we are in. In fact, if you go back to something you wrote 3 years ago, you might be surprised at how much your own writing has changed. But besides all this, the pastoral letters are written for individual church leaders. All of Paul's other letters, except for Philemon, were written for groups of people, and Philemon was not a church leader. So it's a totally different audience, a different setting, and Paul is at a later point in life. Don't you think that Paul, like any other person, can take off that one hat and put on another? Gosh, if you read the papers I wrote in seminary, they're going to sound wildly different than the scripts I write for these YouTube videos. And that's intentional. And even more, it's generally understood that when Paul wrote his letters, he probably used a secretary or amanuensis who wrote down what Paul dictated. Such a person probably didn't just copy word for word what Paul said, but was working with Paul in the writing process, translating Paul's thoughts into something that looks good on print. It could be that the pastoral letters sound different because Paul was using a different amanuensis. Or maybe for the first time he wasn't using an amanuensis. All this goes to show that there are plenty of reasons why the pastoral letters could sound different than other writings of Paul. To say that Paul is not the author is only one explanation, but it's not a good explanation given all the reasons I gave in last week's video why Paul is the true author of the Pastoral Epistles. You may still wonder why the pastoral epistles sound like 2nd century writings. A couple of points here. Well, for one, you run into problems of which came first. Was it 2nd century church authors who made a fake Paul sound like themselves? Or was it real Paul who inspired 2nd century authors to write like him? It could be that 2nd century church authors sound the way they do because they were reading from Paul, and Paul was being innovative in his writing style when he wrote the pastorals. But it's probably an overstatement to even say that the pastoral letters sound like 2nd century writings to begin with. The line between 1st and 2nd century writings is blurry. Scholar J.N.D. Kelly admits that in recent years, liberal scholars have become less certain about their views because they're starting to recognize how much we don't know about Paul's time, the ideas developing, and all that. Even more, Donald Guthrie wrote a very technical paper you can find online showing that many of these 2nd century writing styles appear in the 1st century as well. I have other videos on the authors of the Gospels or Ephesians, which I'll include in this video description. But we made it through for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.